soon. Jolting tales of horror. Creepshow. From the author of Carrie, The Shining, and Cujo. And the creator of Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. You'll scream at ghastly ghouls. Cringe at weird kids. And shiver at the doings of evil doctors.
This is going to be extremely painful, Mr. Verrill.
Creepshow will grab you, grow on you, and give you the creeps.
No, this is going to be an entirely new experience.
Creepshow, the most fun you'll ever have being scared.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Pod and the Pendulum podcast, part of the Morbidly Beautiful Podcast Network. I am your host, Mike Snoonian, joined once again by my co-host, Jerry Smith. Jerry, how are we doing?
Doing great. I'm really excited to talk about this one. This movie is probably one of my favorite anthologies. And like I was saying before we started recording, the word classic's thrown around with so many movies, and I feel like Creepshow is definitely one that deserves that title. So it's going to be fun.
And we're joined once again, back in the crew, in the co-host chair, from Dread Central and Ghastly. We have Brian Kuiper. Brian, how are we?
I'm doing great. I love this movie and very excited to talk about it today.
Excellent. We're glad to have you back, man. It's been a little bit.
It has, but that's okay, you know. I didn't have quite the same connection with Critters as some of the other people that came on, so I was glad to hear them.
Excellent, man. Well, we're glad to have you back in that co-host chair. And yeah, we have a classic tonight. We are, going to be covering the Creepshow series next year, which consists of two excellent movies, one I think being an all-time classic, and as well as a television series that I think we're going to talk about a bit when we get to the third entry, which is the equivalent, from what I understand, of like watching your loved ones die of horrific anal cancer. So we're going to see how that goes. So I have the feeling that we're going to use it as like punishment for the kids. If they're like really bad, we'll say they have to watch Creepshow 3. But we're not here to talk about that tonight. We're here to be positive tonight.
Yes.
Excuse me. And we are here to talk about the 1982 or 83? 82 horror anthology directed by George Romero, written by Stephen King, Creepshow. I know for a lot of us, this is one of the kind of fundamental gateways to our horror movie fandom. And Brian, I know that the moment we mentioned we were doing Creepshow, your hand was raised and you're like, I want to make sure I'm in for this one. So let's start with you. Like, what was it about this series or this movie in particular for you that means so much?
I'm pretty sure I saw the second one first, but Stephen King is, like for so many of us, is God. I mean, he's the pinnacle of just great horror writing and storytelling. And so this was just a great way to see 5 of his stories told well, and and then in Creepshow 2 you have 3 more. And this was one of those gateways where this was got to be one of the first, real horror movies I saw, and seeing it's the gateway, like you said. It's one of those entrees into real horror, but it's got this wraparound with a kid in it, that helps to connect a young person to it, sort of that feeling of alienation and all that stuff that's going on, and then to see this, it's just like Jerry said, it's a classic, and it just means a lot to me.
Mm-hmm. How about yourself, Jerry?
For me, Creepshow was always like a really huge deal because, I mean, growing up, there were only two things I was really into, and that's horror movies and comic books. And what Creepshow is, in so many ways, is not only kind of a living and breathing comic book, but a complete love letter to a lot of the comics that a lot of us just loved. I mean, we'll get into this more as we go on with the history of the film, but Creepshow is, before Tales from the Crypt, the TV show came out, all that we had as far as like films dealing with a lot of like horror anthology stuff, kind of like this stuff, was, the Amicus anthologies, or, 1972's Tales from the Crypt film, or 73's Vault of Horror, that those kind of like EC Comics heavy stories of, morality tales and people getting their comeuppance for being bad people. What Creepshow was that it just incarnate. And it was also, as someone who grew up, Stephen King was like the first, author that just became like God status to me. I came across Eyes of the Dragon when I was a kid, at a secondhand store. And, I had no idea this was a horror author because, it was a fantasy book, and I read it and I instantly bought every single book I could. So not only being a big fan of comics, but also being a big fan of Stephen King, when I first saw this movie, it was like such a huge monumental thing for me, because what it is for comic book fans, it was the ultimate team up. Everyone loved DC Super Friends and all these like crossovers and all this stuff. But I mean, holy shit. We got Stephen King teaming up with George Romero, for a horror fan and a comic book fan, especially a horror fan, like that is the equivalent of, like a Justice League team up,
Well,
so you
this would have been,
Uh-huh.
this would have been like in the early 80s, like Larry Bird, Magic Johnson playing for the same basketball team. I mean, that's really what
totally.
it would have been.
Yeah.
Totally. And also, I mean, as a long time, I mean, growing up, writing was my life. I mean, I've always just been a writer. That's just who I am. It's one of the only things I'm decent at. But also, it kind of introduced me to short form fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being blown away the first time, even as a kid. I mean, a very small kid. I saw this movie way too young. And even then, I was so just impressed with how they could tell a really good story in such a short amount of time. And you would get a movie that, as a kid, anthologies are the greatest things ever, because you get so many different little stories in one movie. And for a kid that kind of has ADHD and kind of all over the place, it's brilliant. And so Creepshow was like, I think, very like game changing for me as a kid.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, like I love short horror movies in general, just because if there's something, if you watch like a few of them in a row, if there's like one you don't like, then maybe you'll like the next one. You're not going to be stuck with it for too long. But the beauty of the first Creepshow is it is all killer and no filler. Like it is 5 segments in a wraparound, and you can make a legitimate argument for each of them as to why it's your favorite, or why it's the best of the bunch. Like we all have our own personal preferences for them overall, but there's none of them that I would dismiss if someone came to me and said, well, this is why I think the wraparound is the best thing, or why something to tide you over is the best. You're going to have that. For me, the original Creepshow, I discovered it through the tie-in comic book that was released with it before I ever got a chance to see the movie.
Oh, nice.
So, and I believe it was like Bernie Wrightson was the illustrator for that, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
I think so, yeah.
He's paired with King on other things like Cycle of the Werewolf. He had illustrated Swamp Thing for a while. He's legendary comic book artist. His illustrated Frankenstein is absolutely gorgeous.
It's incredible, yeah.
And yeah, it just belongs on everybody's bookshelf. So just an absolute fucking legend in the comic industry. But this was at a time where like I would have been 2nd or 3rd grade when this came out, and was just starting to discover, scary movies outside of Saturday afternoon creature features that I would watch with my dad, or staying up late to watch movies with my grandmother, and I was still like not allowed to really watch, like a hard R rated R movie. But if a kid brought in a comic book to school, that just got passed around. Like we would all take turns reading it and then passing it on to the next person. And then eventually, once you got old enough to go and ride your bike 20 minutes to the local video store, and you'd have like the high school kid manned behind the counter who really didn't care what they rented to you. This became like a Saturday night sleepover staple all throughout middle school, and just like a favorite for a lot of us. So cannot say enough wonderful things about this movie, but we're going to try to this afternoon here.
Well, and speaking of the video store, for me, seeing the cover art of this one on the shelf, it's just that skeleton in the box office with the sort of shroud on it. That is one of the great, I know it's just taken straight from the poster, was put on the cover of that VHS box, but man, that was just so evocative to me. And I was like, I need to see whatever has this as the cover for it.
And it shows what a lost art in a lot of ways, like what poster art is, because you really don't get anything nearly this evocative anymore. I mean, when you look at the poster art for Creepshow, you immediately get a handle of what you're in for. And what's funny, when you look at it, it says admission, adults and children. And even though this is like a very gory, bloody movie, it's fun for kids. Like, it's the kind of things it's a little bit of the stuff of nightmares overall, but it is really kid friendly. Like, it's something that I don't have an issue with my daughter at age, when she's 8 years old, we watch this together for the first time, because it's a hell of a lot of fun. And I think it is like a wonderful kind of gateway drug to scary movies for kids overall.
Also, and I know that we're going to get into this later, but another great thing about just that is, as a kid, it is, I feel, even though, like you said, it's gory and stuff, as a kid, it's a kind of a safe movie to watch. You know, it's entertaining. But as an adult, watching it a few years ago, I watch it pretty regularly, but just a few years ago, it just kind of clicked with me that, I remember watching it and thinking, like, man, when I was a kid, I was really entertained by this. As an adult, I'm really entertained by this.
Yeah.
And God, this movie has so much to it as far as themes and very interesting things to say. And it gets dark. It gets emotional. It gets heartbreaking. I love films like Creepshow that start off as a kid, you're entertained by them, but as an adult, you find a lot of meat and substance thematically to them.
Right.
Yeah.
There are a few things sadder than going back to something that you loved in your childhood and revisiting as an adult, and then just like not being able to enjoy it nearly as much, and being like, what did I see in this in the first place? But that's not the case here. I think the case with Creepshow, and I think that's what you get when you get a master storyteller like Stephen King, and you get someone like a George Romero, who is really kind of operating at his peak at this point. You get some, and for the first time, Romero is actually handed a pretty decent chunk of money to put something together, and you can let him kind of run a little bit wild in that sandbox. And I don't want to say they cut corners, because they didn't, but they weren't handed like an infinite sum of cash, but they were able to definitely use every single penny of that to create something that's pretty spectacular.
Oh, definitely.
I think your cat agrees, Jerry, too. I think your
cat my cat agrees.
No, that's all right. He's welcome on the show as a guest anytime.
Motherfucker. No, I'm just kidding. I'm gonna ask my cat what he thinks of Creepshow.
Yeah. So let's talk about the roots of the movie overall. Who would like to kick that discussion off?
Yeah. I mean, I'll put my piece in it, but I mean, your notes are pretty good. Creepshow, a lot of it had to do with, EC Comics. It's undeniable. It's very much a part of the fiber of Creepshow and every kind of anthology from that time. Like I said, we didn't have Tales from the Crypt, the TV show, yet. So this is kind of the first glimpse, as far as an American film, that really tackles the EC Comics fill.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even before Romero and King came in, you know, you had books like Tales from the Crypt or Vault of Horror. You know, there was science fiction books. EC Comics was kind of like the bastard company that no one else wanted to, like, the parents were afraid of it, you know. DC and Marvel and that kind of stuff was the safe place, but the EC Comics were the comics that kids would hide under their beds. You know, even Carpenter kind of pokes fun at that in the first Halloween, you know, Radioactive Man, all this stuff, you know. And what they were...
Laser Man.
Yeah, it's like Laurie Strode even looks down on that shit. But, you know, EC Comics came from William Gaines, you know, who saw potential in these fantastical tales of horror and sci-fi. They would be gory as hell. I mean, the blood would just leap off the screen. The art was great. And, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about him a lot, but Al Feldstein, who was one of the main writers of so many of these books, and then he went on to kind of run Mad Magazine for years. They were crucial in getting a company that horror fans and people growing up just adored, because they weren't just, the gore was there, but it wasn't just gore for gore's sake. It all meant something, you know. You'd have these awful people doing these horrific things, and by the end, you know, with the EC Comics, you know, with any of those comics, that you're going to get a lot of comeuppance, like I said, at the end. You know, everyone that does these awful things, it shows... their morality plays in a lot of ways. They show all the consequences for being awful, you know, shitty people. And I think Creepshow is kind of born from that love of those.
In a lot of ways, those EC Comics are kind of a update on Grimm's fairy tales, where your typical, like an Aesop fable, a Grimm fairy tale, which is basically a little mini morality play that are there to teach lessons. And what you have with EC Comics, you have this generation of kids and young adults that have just survived the Second World War. So you have like a lot, in some cases you have these, you know, young men coming back from, you know, the fields of Europe or, you know, in the Pacific, and they had grown up on like your Batman, your Superman comics. All of a sudden, a spandex-clad superhero punching someone like the Riddler in the jaw doesn't really have a lot of appeal, you know, after you watch like your best friend in a foxhole get both of his legs blown off. So you have these soldiers that return back to civilian life now, and they are drawn to these titles that are like very violent and gory and bloody, that have this real undercurrent of dark gallows humor that run throughout them. But at the end of the day, like, they're also these little morality tales, because typically in them, your evil character, like usually your protagonist, is some sort of sick fucking bastard that deserves to get his comeuppance, and they usually do. And it's usually done in such a way that the thing that they crave the most, or the thing that they thought was their greatest strength, ends up kind of turning back around on them and biting them in the ass and being kind of their own undoing at that point. And I think that's something we see in Creepshow overall.
Oh, totally. I mean, not just, and the thing is, it's not revenge. I think maybe a lot of people get that wrong. You know, it's not just selfish revenge in these tales, especially in Creepshow. It's about people getting, you know, like it says in the movie, like there's a great documentary on it, they're just desserts. You know, they very much they get what's coming to them. And as a viewer, especially a kid, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I was a kid, like, there was nothing better than seeing like bullies and assholes get what's coming to them.
Absolutely.
You know, as somebody that was bullied so heavily in school because of like, that's what's crazy. Growing up, it wasn't cool to like horror films, you know, where I came from. It wasn't cool to like comic books. You know, now kind of the assholes became a lot of the gatekeepers of this stuff. But I mean, being a kid going through that stuff, seeing a film like Creepshow or reading these back issues and different things of EC Comics, that was huge to me, because these tales, especially in this film, they're so fun to watch, because you know these awful people are going to get it pretty soon.
And you see, like, it's funny you say like how nowadays, like, horror movies are quote unquote in at this point. Superhero movies are in at this point, and you're seeing that the folks that were marginalized for so many years for their fandom become, in a lot of cases, the worst bunch of gatekeepers. And kind of like now, I'll say this first before I go any further. Like, one of the things I would say that is getting me through this whole shelter in place is the horror community, because there are so many wonderful people that are in it, and these nightly tweet-alongs and watch-alongs and script readings and jumping online to play like Friday the 13th with a bunch of friends on the PlayStation are really getting me through overall. And I think that it's no shock that it's the horror movie community doing this. You don't really see the same thing being done for romantic comedies. You don't really even see the same thing being done for, say, like people who love Marvel movies, which has a fandom of like 20, 30 times that of your typical horror movie fan overall. It's really the community of horror folks that do drive this. That being said, you have this segment of people that, and it's a lot like punk rock too, where I like their first 7-inch better when a band gets too big. It's very much like, oh, you like horror movies? Well, what is the name of the father in The Shining? What is the name of, like, you're wearing a Halloween shirt? Like who did the score for it overall? What's the one that doesn't have Michael Myers in it? It's like, get the fuck out of here with that overall, where, a little bit of power can corrupt someone absolutely.
You know what my favorite thing to do to people like that is to kind of like make them
kick
feel
them
stupid.
In the balls as hard as
dude, growing up, I've gotten that so many times. Well, like you said, well, what's a Halloween without Michael Myers in it? Like, what are you talking about? He's in all of them. You're not a horror fan. He's not in 3. Yeah, he's on the TV twice, he's motherfucker.
Yeah.
Like, get out of here. No, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I had to watch and review a movie recently called We Summon the Darkness, and one of the moments in the movie that made me laugh is this trio, without spoiling anything, this trio of like metal girls meet up with these trio of like metalhead guys, and the guys like instantly they're like, yeah, well, what was your first show? What was your first show? Trying to like make sure these girls are real metal fans. So it's funny to hear that comparison with horror, because I mean, yeah, like these people, we were the ones picked on, and now it seems like a lot of the people that were picked on kind of get off doing that. It's a weird concept. I don't get it.
It really is, and it's usually a dude doing it to a woman.
Totally.
It's
99 times out of 100, it's a dude doing it to a woman.
I know I'm jumping movies, but I want to send a giant Venus flytrap to eat them.
Yes,
right.
Very good. Hey, did you? Yeah. You just mentioned Summon the Darkness. Did you interview Alexandra Daddario?
I didn't know.
Okay.
There was a live Q&A that she did that the publicist asked me to post about. But yeah, because of all this like virus stuff, I kind of didn't do any interviews for that stuff.
I was just wondering if you were going to ask her if she would go out with me. Because she is beautiful, and I bet she smells like peaches, and I think we would really connect. I think I've shared this story before, but like I have a massive crush on Amber Benson, who played Tara on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and we were able to host a screening of a movie she produced and starred in called Dust Up, and took her to dinner. And, my wife came along for that, and in front of my wife tried to tell Amber Benson that, my wife died tragically in a fire. I'm a widower. I was able to save the kittens, and it was really sad. My wife was like, dude, I'm right here, But to be fair, if Jensen Ackles and I were ever walking down the street, my wife would push me in front of a moving bus and then run to Jensen Ackles for comfort at that point.
See, I think my wife would do that for if Mark Duplass was walking across the street and he was about to get hit by a car. Like suddenly I'd find myself in front of a semi, and Duplass would be like, okay.
Can't blame her for that, though.
Can't blame her for that. You're right.
So back to EC Comics. What ends up happening with EC Comics, Gaines and Feldstein are, they have Vault of Horror, Tales from the Crypt, they're about to launch another horror comic under the EC Comics banner when a book comes out and becomes the talk of the nation. It's Frederick Wortham's The Seduction of the Innocent. And Wortham's book really takes the comic book industry to task with these claims that it offers titillation and nothing else, and what's happening to the minds of young children, especially boys, is nothing short of criminal. It becomes this thing, and this is right at the height as well as McCarthyism in the United States. You have Joseph McCarthy accusing anyone and everyone that has ever wronged him in some way of being a communist. So you have the government hosting all of these panels now, and now they start taking a real long look at what is going on with comic books and what they're doing to children. All of a sudden, school teachers, psychologists, doctors, parents, they start looking at funny books in a way that they never were before. I mean, before there was comic book collecting, a comic book was just something a kid would take like a couple nickels and go to the local mom and pop shop and buy something off the rack, read it, and then probably throw it out. I mean, if they kept it at all, it was at the bottom of a box that was in the basement. It wasn't something that was like really seen as anything but kind of like disposable fun for kids.
Yeah, they were pulp magazines of their day.
Exactly.
So they were meant to deteriorate and be tossed off.
So when The Seduction of the Innocent hits, you start seeing the major comic book companies like DC Comics shift gears. So you go from having like the character of the Batman is probably the best example. His adventures go from being kind of gritty crime noir stories to these really colorful otherworldly stories where you have like Batman launch into outer space, or he has to wear all these bright and colorful outfits. Like I remember growing up when I got into Batman comics, buying these collections like the greatest Batman stories ever told, and you would have these stories from like the mid 50s through the 60s where like Batman is wearing like pink costumes and fighting aliens, and no longer like the Joker is no longer any sort of threat. Like instead of the Joker going on a murder spree, like the Joker is on a mission to make sure that Commissioner Gordon gets pied in the face during like assembly to get the key to this Gotham City or something, so he's embarrassed. Like all of the hard edges are completely sanded off of any character in order to make them sanitized and safe for public consumption. So while the comic book industry, the mainstream comic industry, is doing that, who would like to tackle what people are seeing when they open up like EC Comics? Like now you have, I don't know, the embodiment of Tom Atkins' father's character in Creepshow now picking up Tales from the Crypt for the first time. What is he seeing inside of there, gentlemen?
Well, what you get and what caused such a hoopla is, I mean, like you said, you get the Batman comics that's sending Batman into outer space, or you're getting, Joker isn't a murderous bastard anymore. He's silly. And then Batman fights a man made out of clay now, stuff like that. Where in the EC comics, you would get a woman who chopped her husband into little pieces, have, people come back to life to kill her, or, all through the house, which is like my favorite Tales from the Crypt story around. You have a woman killing off her husband for money, and then a deranged Santa Claus breaking into her house to kill her and her kid,
Right.
They were graphic. And I feel like the blood in the guts kind of it meant something. I think it's warranted. But as a parent who doesn't pay attention to what their kid is reading or watching or listening to, suddenly they're being told by the government and everyone else, their churches and stuff, what's going on. And then the parent comes across this stuff. It feels like the end of the world. I mean, when I was a kid, I don't know if you guys know it, but there was a book called like Lambs to the Slaughter that came out. And growing up in church, that was a huge book, because basically what it said was all of these Saturday morning cartoons that your kids are watching are satanic. You know, Smurfs will make them be Satanists because Gargamel has a pentagram at the beginning. You know, and it was an expose that caused such an uproar in my church that, I mean, every single thing that I would read, comic books, you know, movies I'd watch, music I would listen to, was put under the microscope. And this is exactly what happened with EC Comics. They were kind of the scapegoat for all this scare. And it was kind of like a pre-Satanic Panic era.
Right.
You know, that was my era of growing up as Satanic Panic. But before that, the EC Comics era, when that happened, I mean, that was the equivalent. That was the equivalent of Marilyn Manson coming out with Antichrist Superstar. You know, that was the early parents getting pissed about Cardi B talking about like eating ass. You know, like that was the silly like hoopla that parents went through because they thought that EC Comics was going to corrupt their kids and make them chop people up.
Yeah, and like parents didn't even have to turn far into the book to see some really horrible shit their kids are looking at. I mean, you look at some of the reprints of the original Tales from the Tales from the Crypt comics and the Vault of Horror, and you see like a dude cutting the cord to a guillotine dropping down on a guy's head, you know, right on the front cover. So it's not even like this stuff was kind of hidden within the pages of it overall. Like it was like totally out front and center. So you have like a lot of monocles popping out all of a sudden.
Well, even on the covers, I mean, on the covers you get like little circles with like the head of the Crypt Keeper and, you know, all these random characters that you can tell going into it just from the cover that you're in for some shit.
Yeah.
In the 80s, though, there was something else that was going on and this was actually my first introduction to Stephen King, and I just realized it really after watching Creepshow again, you know, like last week. In the early 80s, there was a short-lived version of The Twilight Zone, and it wasn't great. However, that and the reboot of Alfred Hitchcock Presents were both on in the early 80s, and they were much more sort of EC Comics influenced than the original series were. There was a story, I only ever saw the episode once, but it was the Stephen King story Grandma for the Twilight Zone. This teleplay was written by Harlan Ellison, and I still remember that. I mean, I must have been 4 years old, and I still remember the sound of the grandmother's voice, "Coffee, get me my coffee," you know, and to this little kid. And so I think it's funny, you know, because there was sort of this backlash against it, but then all those kids that grew up with the EC Comics, you know, like Stephen King, like Harlan Ellison, like some of these other people, started infusing it into the television of the early 80s as well. So for that sort of fed into things like Creepshow and then eventually Tales of the Crypt and things like that. And so there was some stuff that was happening about this time that was sort of this backlash against the repression of things like EC and those sorts of tales. Even the original Alfred Hitchcock Presents in the 50s and 60s had some stuff that was, you know, like a woman finds out her husband is cheating, so she kills him with a leg of lamb. You know, a frozen leg. You know, I mean, things like that. You know, so I mean, there was stuff around. I think Hitchcock could get away with it, you know, because of the clout he'd developed by that time. But anyway, that was a tangent. But I think that early 80s was there, though we had things like Lambs for the Slaughter, and I remember that too. Not as well as you, but I remember some of that around during that time. But there also was sort of this subversive stuff coming in on TV, and it was on TV, so it was fine. It was on during prime time, so, you know, my parents would let me watch it.
I think that goes with the EC Comics too.
Yeah,
you know, these were on the shelves at, you know, the local drugstore when EC Comics was like a huge thing. You know, so parents thought it was okay.
Exactly.
You know, And kids thought it was okay they thought, it was okay to get. So when that whole shift came and they came down really hard on EC, I mean, they took a very successful company and just brought it to his knees just because of that fear.
Yeah.
Right. By 1956, the whole comic line is wiped out with the exception of Mad Magazine, which survived and became really for 6 decades the premier kind of satire magazine for wise-ass kids and young adults.
So great.
And really just shaped like the comedy underpinnings for so many people.
Yeah.
And I think it sadly just this past year kind of shipped its last magazine, which is really kind of sad. But it, survived for many, many years. And it was like the one thing that survived the really mid-50s purge was like Mad. But Vault of Horror, Tales from the Crypt, all of these, they die by 1956 because of the uproar around this book, Seduction of the Innocent. Okay. Yeah. But it was around long enough to make, like you just said, Brian, an impression on a number of like people that went on to be so influential starting in the 60s and 70s with horror movies, including a young Stephen King and a younger or slightly older George Romero at that point. So these two were originally slated to hook up over an adaptation of Stephen King's second novel, Salem's Lot. Like Carrie comes out and hits like a world of fire, bestseller everywhere. Brian De Palma adapts the story into an absolutely classic film that still holds up to this day.
Hell yeah, it does.
And
it does, yes.
Then Stephen King drops what might be my favorite, a really early look at what sort of world building King would be capable of that you would see later on in all the books that tie like the fictional town of Castle Rock together, or Derry when it comes to it. You see this world building done so early on in Salem's Lot.
Done all the way up to like Under the Dome and things like that. Which King's idea was, what if Dracula was alive today and just lived in a small rural town as opposed to the mountains of Transylvania? What would he be like? So that there's a lot of interest in making that movie. Romero is coming off the success of Dawn of the Dead. The two meet up, they discuss plans, they get to know one another, and what do they bond over? They bond over not just their love of horror, but their love of all these old comic books, the EC comic series. Salem's Lot, they decide we're going to make a 2-part TV movie out of it. Romero decides to pass. It's then filmed by Steven Spielberg in an all-time classic. Toby Hooper in an all-time classic. This is my running. If you take Jason out of the final chapter, this is my running gag. I like my running gag. If you don't like it, go to hell. Leave me a 2-star review on iTunes.
say that you need to get kicked off.
All right. So Romero and King eventually decide they want to work together. Romero has this idea for an anthology movie. But Romero's idea, let's do an anthology movie, but let's do like the history of horror. Let's do the history of movie making. Like we'll do, one that'll be in like 1:33:1 scope overall, and it'll be in black and white all the way up through now. We'll hit every era. We'll do like one giant monster movie like the 1950s Radioactive. Like that'll be a segment. And Stephen King, in between like sniffing cocaine at this point, which that's the era that we're in, to be fair, we're fastly approaching maximum King Stephen King right now. So it's like, fuck that. We're going to do a tribute to EC Comics. And every segment's going to be over the top. It's going to be really gory. There's going to be tons of black humor to it. They're going to be these little morality tales, but we are going to take our love for these comics that we grew up in, and we're going to do our best job at basically replicating that for the big screen, right down to having like segments of the movie look like, 4-color comic book panels that just like absolutely pop off the screen. So do we dig into the movie? Do we have anything more for the background, or are we good to go to discuss the movie?
I think we should jump right in.
Yeah,
I'm excited. Let's do this.
Yeah.
We tend to be generous, very loose with our structure overall. We tend to jump here, there, and everywhere in terms of like how we cover movies without much of a structure. But I thought we would try, because there are 5 neatly divided up segments to this film. We would try to go segment by segment through it, and I doubt we'll be able to stick to that format. But let's give it a shot.
Do our best.
Let's do it.
All right. So let's start with Father's Day. Who wants to give a quick, like, little rundown of what this is about?
I can do this one. Then
Okay.
I like this one.
Okay.
Father's Day is kind of the first in the anthology. It's about this really miserable old, kind of head of the family. He's very much a patriarch. His fortune's been made through like just dishonesty, whether it's like murder, like murder or fraud or everything else. Bootlegging, so many things. He's killed on Father's Day by his daughter Bedelia, which is played by Vivica Lindfors, who was in one of my favorite movies of all time, The Exorcist 3. So it's so cool to see her in this too.
Mm-hmm.
And she's kind of crazy herself after putting up with this guy's like abuse for years and years, and so she murders him. All of his other siblings, granddaughters, grandchildren, everyone shows up, and it's basically a story of them getting their just desserts, them getting what's coming to them, and it's a lot of fun. I like this one a lot.
And before Bedelia kills her father, what drives that whole thing is like Bedelia had taken a lover, and the father could not have that, so he is strongly hinted that he was gunned down at the behest of the patriarch of the family. And then you have this just wonderful moment where you have the dad just sitting in his chair, banging his cane, screaming, "Where's my cake?" over and over, which I don't think is cake on Father's Day a thing, and I'm just missing out because
I don't think people give each other cake on Father's Day.
I've never experienced that.
No, you get coffee mugs and like.
I think typically no. I mean, my wife makes me a cake. I think almost on every holiday. Actually, it's just usually like a Twin Peaks cake or something waiting for me. So maybe.
Mm-hmm. But I have never heard that. But this father is determined to get his cake. So now you have 3 years later, the family is gathering around and they're waiting for Bedelia to show up for this big dinner. And one thing that runs, like, this is a very like 1%er heavy film overall. Like you have 4 of the 5 segments surround really kind of like the creme de la creme of like old money society overall, and it is never not a good time watching a bunch of like evil millionaires get their comeuppance, right?
Oh, totally. And it's funny when basically what resurrects Nathan, the patriarch, what resurrects him is whiskey gets spilled on his headstone. Like it's such a funny like approach. No. There's no ritual. There's nothing like that. It's whiskey on a headstone.
Yeah. You got Bedelia, who is like the fun, drunk out of her mind aunt who's just gone crazy with guilt and crazy with sadness. And she's really a sad character. She's like the first victim of the resurrected dad, which is really too bad. Because like she hadn't really done anything wrong except for fall in love with another person and smash her abusive dad's head in with an ashtray.
That's it, right?
Really, aside from those two things, like she's as pure as the driven snow, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. No, but like even the cast of characters, like the family members, I think to this day, and it's funny as you put this in your notes, and I'm right there with you. I think to this day, the 2 like my two favorite dance sequences in film. Like fuck Flashdance. La La Land ain't shit. The two best dance sequences ever: Crispin Glover in the final chapter and Ed Harris in this segment in Creepshow.
Yeah.
Like, I have no idea what he's doing. I don't even think he knows what he's doing.
He has
Maybe
no
he got
idea.
maybe he got some of that King Coke. But like, it's a trip to watch.
No, if you watch Just Desserts, the making of Creepshow, which is a really fun little 90-minute documentary about like the making of this movie, Ed Harris does appear briefly in it, and he was like, yeah, George just said like go over the top, just like act kind of goofy, and he's like, to be really honest, I'm not really thrilled with what he had me do there. He was kind of hoping
like a bobblehead.
Yeah, he does,
Yeah,
and he's got like this thing where like his right arm is raised over his head and his hand is tilting down, and he's got like this like pucker on his face, like he's almost like, it looks like he's ready to go down and give someone head, basically, is what and you had this really shitty disco music, and I don't know, like, do you think that the music there was more to, like, oh yeah, disco music is in, that's what they would dance to, or to show how out of touch this family would have been? Because I would think by the time Creepshow comes out, like, disco is long dead, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. But I also don't know if that was the music played during filming, because I know during the final chapter they said that Crispin Glover was actually dancing to Back in Black. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, if they did some of that bait and switch, like the band AFI. They have this song where I can't remember the name of the song. It's on one of their It's one of the Tamer songs, but like the song is like them playing, and there's all these dudes moshing and fighting, and it's such a like a tame song, but while they were filming that music video, they played Hatebreed for the people dancing.
Beautiful.
So, like, I wonder if they had done something a little different while they were filming than what, the disco that we got in the actual movie.
All right, you might be right, but it's a goofy choice of music overall.
Oh, beautiful. Totally.
But what do we think of the creature effects in this particular short? I absolutely love the zombie effects in here overall, because we've seen I hate to say realistic looking zombies, but you've seen kind of like the more kind of human looking zombies in Romero's other work, and now you have something you have this really grotesque, maggots are crawling out of it. It's really just like a skeleton in a suit in a lot of ways. And you have that gurgly voice, like, where's my cake?
I want my cake. Father's Day, I want my cake.
I love the creature effects in this short overall.
Well, they're very close to the source material and what they're influenced by. Like Romero did have those kind of realistic zombies in, like in Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead and stuff. But I love that they knew exactly what they wanted to achieve with Creepshow, and that was a love letter to EC Comics. And I think the creature design, and actually the designs, every design in the film is such a testament to that admiration of EC that they had. Seeing a head, I can't remember the character's name, but her head on the platter at the end. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the coolest shots in the whole movie. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
So the short ends with just like, and again, you get to see early on the look that they're going for, where you have like the camera kind of freezes and you have just like red and blue, like really bright lighting in the background, and you have these over the top expressions on Ed Harris's face. And his wife or girlfriend's face, Cass's face there. So my question is this: do you think they were the next victims, or are they sitting down for some head cake?
Jeez. No, I think they were all going to get it.
Yeah.
There's no way any of them are escaping that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And when did I also am interested? Like, when did zombies? Oh, it wasn't Ed Harris at the end. Ed Harris is crushed by a tombstone.
That's right.
Before we get a very strongly worded letter from somebody where I've got that wrong. No, Ed Harris's character is crushed by a tombstone because zombies in this one have the power of telekinesis.
They do, don't they?
I guess so. All right. What else do we have on Father's Day before moving forward?
I think the music is a big part of Father's Day.
Mm-hmm.
The music. In fact, I think the score in general in Creepshow is so good.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite horror scores, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, yeah, Father's Day. It's a good intro to the whole film. It's like Brian said. It's not one that super resonated with me. But to be honest, it's fun. It's a lot of fun, and I think it's a good stairway to the rest of the segments, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's sort of like when you make a I used to make like mixtapes and things like that. You start with a good song, but then you sort of kick it up a little bit on the second one. It gives then the rules to making the tape, like in High Fidelity.
Yeah, no, totally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is kind of like a good film mixtape.
Yeah. And you mentioned the score, Jerry, by John Harrison, who was a longtime collaborator with George Romero, and he would go on to do the score for Day of the Dead and Tales from the Dark Side. It was almost like a happy accident that he actually did. He actually did this score. Oh man, I did not know a GIF of Ed Harris dancing.
Well,
existed,
there we go.
But there
I thought I'd help you out there.
By the way, he is so much as much as we laugh at it, he is so much smoother than I could ever be.
Oh, dude, right?
All right. So, I mean,
I'm loving it.
Let's be honest. At the end of the day, he's still one. Ed Harris is one smooth motherfucker still.
No, that's why I said rightfully so when you talked about him getting crushed. I'll never be as cool as Ed Harris.
No, absolutely not. But he basically went to Romero and said, hey, I kind of compose music every now and again. And Romero gave him a shot, and we got this absolutely wonderful score that goes along with the movie overall. An absolute classic score.
I think speaking on the Father's Day one being kind of like that stairway to the rest of them, I think what comes next is, I think, like Brian said, when Brian used to make mixtapes, you start out with that, then you have the second track kind of hit harder. I think the second segment in this movie is easily my favorite one out of any of the Creepshow films.
It's mine too.
Interesting.
The only one that comes close for me is in Creepshow 2, The Raft.
Oh, so good.
Yeah, so this is my favorite as well.
What's interesting is growing up, this was my least favorite segment.
Oh, yeah?
It was because of the performance of King. But then going back, and I think it was probably 2 years ago, was the first time I had watched Creepshow in maybe a decade. And how much more I was able to appreciate what King was kind of going for with this performance, but also the sadness of this one.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about the lonesome death of Jody Verrill, the second segment here in Creepshow. So Brian and Jerry, since this is your favorite, take it away.
Oh,
go ahead. I'm gonna let you do this one. I have a lot to say about this one, so I'll let you set it up.
Okay. So it has sort of the similar setup to something like The Blob or something like that, except that our character is Jordy Verrill, who is sort of a bumpkin living out in a shack in the middle of nowhere on a dirt farm or something, and he sees a meteor come out of the sky, and it lands on his farm, and he goes out back to investigate, and he touches it, and he gets meteor-shit on him.
Meteor-shit!
Meteor-shit!
That is my, Stephen King should have gotten an Oscar for the reading of that line alone. So meteor-shit. Yeah. Anyway, so as time goes on, it begins to sprout. Weeds, grass, moss. I don't know how would you describe
this weird moss.
Yeah, meteor-shit moss, and and it begins to overtake his whole body, and he tries all sorts of different ways to get it off, and it just continues to consume him until he just can't take any more, and he takes care of it all by by shooting himself in the head. Spoiler alert. So anyway,
see, as a kid,
yeah,
for me as a kid, I thought this was a very playful and fun segment.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
Stephen King, he plays Geordie so over the top and kind of like silly. You know, he reminded me of I have an uncle that would use phrases like, you know, some bitch and like idiot and shit like that too. Yeah. So it felt very much like seeing my uncle and like, oh, this is funny. As an adult watching this, it is such a heartbreaking segment. It really because is. It's about a man's desperation. Like if you think about it, I mean, yeah, back then when it takes place, you know, money, obviously a little bit of money meant a lot of money then, but the whole idea of the short is Stephen King's character. He just wants to make enough money to pay off that $200 loan from the bank. Right. And there's such desperation that he touches this meteor. He kind of has daydreams that he'll sell it and be able to pay off his loan and live like a decent life. Not even a great life, but a decent one of not being in a shack. And that desperation takes him over. That's very much what the weeds and the moss and everything is. It takes him over and being bombarded by this depression that comes with being overburdened with debt and all these things in life. Like how many of us go through that to where it feels like it's unbearable. Right. And as a kid, I thought it was funny that he blows his own head off and there's moss and green blood everywhere. As an adult, I mean, this segment speaks to me profoundly. It's like, you know what I mean? Like it's silly to watch, but at the same time, this is such a layered story.
Well, it's how you have this like kernel of one good idea or one ray of hope. Like this thing is coming to your life where it could answer all of your problems in that moment, but because of crippling insecurity, because of your past history, because of all your negative self-talk and self-doubt, that's very much like you said, Jerry, what the meteor-shit and the moss all represent, and how it can very quickly overwhelm and smother out any ray of hope you have. And that's really at a level that a lot of times depression and anxiety and paranoia really work at overall.
Totally.
So you see that happen really quick. And these interludes, like King's interactions with Bingo O'Malley, who, you know, he plays like a scientist that has varying degrees of interest in King's mind in terms of like buying out the meteor from him. And then, you know, what really is that last interaction between King and O'Malley, when O'Malley is his dead father, speaking to him, saying like, look, you know, if you go in that warm bathtub right now, that's it for you. Like, you're a dead man. But, you know, Geordie Verro no longer cares because he's in so much agony in that moment that he just wants to escape it for just a minute.
No, totally. And it's funny because Father's Day, I mean, I'm sure, you know, there's definitely themes in there because I feel like all of King and Romero's work are heavily thematical, you know, but I think out of all of them, out of any segment in this entire film, the one that has the most meat to it as far as being about something is definitely this segment. Like it's just so sad. And, you know, it's easy to laugh at King's delivery because it is over the top and it is silly, but there's also like such humanity and kind of like fragility to his performance, you know. And I think Stephen King's great in this movie.
Yeah, I think he's pretty wonderful in it. It's the one segment we said early on how these all tend to be little morality tales. This is really the one segment out of the 5 and the wraparound where a character doesn't really get comeuppance. He's really not punished for his crime whatsoever. Like in Father's Day, Bedelia is killed because she murdered her father. So she gets her punishment, and then the rest of the family are killed off because they really remain silent. You could argue, well, what are they really guilty of? I mean, they're guilty of basically accepting this inheritance they didn't earn and remaining silent while their dad was murdered because he was just a ripe old bastard. Here, Jordy Verrill is just like he's a poor farmer that just wants a little bit more comfort in his life. And he's, overwhelmed by it. He's found something great that people are going to want. And for the first time in his whole life, like somebody is going to be interested in him. Like he's going to be the center of attention. And the poor guy doesn't know what he has gotten himself into with it. And King is wonderful in this. I mean, you see it's played for laughs. It's really over the top. I mean, we said meteor-shit, but you get like, oh, you old lunkhead, which is wonderful. Instead of son of a bitch, you get some bitch. Instead of idiot, you get idjit. I just love the way King speaks in this short. I really, really found it wonderful.
And this is the voice he puts into a lot of his, characters throughout his work. Especially it seems to me in the earlier work, especially, he would use sort of those regional dialects and actually write them into the voices of the characters so well. It's because he knew these people.
Yeah, I feel like King's character in Maximum Overdrive at the beginning, this machine is calling me an asshole. I feel like that would have been Jordy's like wealthier cousin.
Sure. If Jordy had gotten that $200 from Bingo and Mally,
he would have got those flip glasses.
At that point, he would have done that. And like you said, those final minutes of the short, those final moments of him just really fumbling for the shotgun and not just killing himself, but begging, like absolutely begging, please God, let my luck be good this one time. But the very, very end of the short is even more chilling when it pans out and you see just how quickly the meteor-shit has taken over the farm, and you get that little radio voiceover saying, hey, we're in for some bad weather. It's going to, farmers are going to love this because we're going to have like 3 days to a week's worth of rain. And it pans out to the roadside and you see like Portland is 29 miles away and Boston is like 200 miles away. And you realize just how quickly this pandemic is going to spread at that point, which I don't know, like right now where we're doing all of this social distancing and sheltering in place, like it was a little bit more chilling than normal to see that kind of hit home. Like that was a bit, and you get the early appearance of a sign for Castle Rock. Right, which would go on to be such a fixture in the work of Stephen King.
We also get his voice at the end, right before he kills himself. Like it's so sad sounding, and it's kind of like put through processors, for a specific vocal effect. But it just like you hear him just completely taken over by this thing. So when he shoots himself, it's like his only way out, and it's just like it's just heart wrenching, man.
So our next short is Something to Tide You Over, and it's the one that I forgot existed until I went to rewatch the movie a couple years ago. And hot damn, I love this short.
I love this one too.
Well, for me, it was Leslie Nielsen here because I'm sure I had seen The Naked Gun, and I only knew him from that.
Right.
By this time, and I had seen little bits of Cheers here and there. That was sort of my parents' show, not mine. But to see Leslie Nielsen in a serious role just sort of threw me off. I mean, it's an odd role, but it's not Frank Drebin.
What's crazy is like I had the same thing. I think I saw the first Naked Gun first before this movie. So it was really like jaunting, even as a kid, being like, what? Like he's a bad guy and he's serious? But I mean, Leslie Nielsen, I mean, he was a very serious actor for decades.
Forbidden Planet.
All that stuff. I mean, even Police Squad, which is what the Naked Gun kind of was spawned from, that TV show. I mean, it's hilarious, but that was very like few and far between as far as comedic roles. It's interesting that later on in his career he became known primarily for those.
For like spoof movies, for the Naked Gun trilogy, for Dracula Dead and Love It. And he had this just, wonderful sense of comic timing, and he just knew how to play the kind of buffoon that you knew how to root for. But here he brings like such a sinister edge to his character here, and it's so believable, and it's so wonderful, and it's so cartoonishly evil that I absolutely love what Nielsen brings to the table. Brian, it's funny you mentioned Cheers, because that movie was such a huge part of like watching that with my parents as a kid. And I remember like when that show was going off the air, like our friends were going to get together for like a watch along for it, and I was grounded for doing something stupid and couldn't go to my friend's house. And as I look out my window, Frank the turkey is going through our yard. So our town's local legend is. I love this turkey, man. If I could run outside and hug him right now, I absolutely would.
You have a local turkey that walks around your town?
I live in like this.
On Twitter?
I live in this really small kind of farm town, and there are like we routinely have deer and like wild turkey in our backyard, but there's this one turkey, Frank, who he'll wander up the road to the downtown center and hold up traffic. And there are videos of like the local police trying to wrangle him while there's like cars backed up on every side, and the police are literally like chasing this turkey around the street.
And so this legendary turkey is in your yard right now?
Right now he's in my yard. He's made appearances before.
Great.
When we had our new bed delivered, he like stood in the front yard and squawked at the delivery people. Yeah.
Well, now we have our special guest Frank the turkey on this episode.
So, nice. But Nielsen is great, and this is just before Cheers hits. And a matter of fact, in Just Desserts, Romero shares the story of like Danson saying how like, I just got this pilot. It's about like I'm gonna be a bartender. I don't know, man. I don't know who's gonna watch this show. And it went on Anchor. At Anchor. NBC for so many years as part of
such a great show.
This was not planned at all, but I just looked down. I happened to grab my Cheers shirt, and I'm wearing it right now.
Wonderful.
So, who knew?
That was my favorite. That was one of my favorite parts about VFW, seeing George Wendt back in a bar.
It's great.
No, but like this segment, I think it's really good, and it's like it's a very like lurid kind of soap opera heavy segment.
It is.
It's really great. For anyone who hasn't seen it, you shouldn't be listening to this episode because it's Creepshow. Go watch it. But if you haven't seen it, it's about these two lovers who have an affair, and the woman wants to leave Leslie Nielsen's character, this abusive husband, and he won't let her out of the relationship, and he basically kills her and her dude, played by Ted Danson, and he drowns them, and they come back for revenge.
Is Nielsen abusive? Do you think he's an abusive husband or an asshole?
Well, I think based on murdering them and drowning them, he's
sure.
It's probably not his first go around.
Okay.
I've always gotten that impression. He's obsessed with technology too,
right.
which
That's true.
So,
I just got the impression that he could give two shits about his wife, and it's not about the fact that she was leaving him. It was just about the fact that, well, I guess, that is abusive. What am I thinking? It was just about the fact that you don't take something from this character. Like, once he thinks that it's his until he's done with it, and no one else could take it from him at that point.
Well, he has to own everything. That's why he has the latest audio equipment. That's why he has the latest video equipment in it. He's like this guy obsessed with just being the best and having everything.
Right.
So to have this wife that doesn't love him, who's in love with someone else, it pushes him over the edge because he's an asshole, and I think he's abusive.
Yeah, I agree. You are right.
The moment that really gets me for this one is he has such a playful and just devilish approach to his character. Like he's so into drowning them and killing them, basically.
He has the time of his life during it.
He absolutely
And
oh man, when they come back as the zombies and there's like seaweed hanging off of them, and the design is great. He doesn't like, he gets scared, but even at the end, he's like calling them on their shit. Like Leslie Nielsen dies in this movie basically talking shit to the zombies that are killing them. Like, and it's great.
It's such, and again, this harkens back to the over-the-top nature of EC Comics and the nature of like the funny books overall. But he doesn't just kill his wife and her lover. He buries them up to their neck in sand, and he buries them what seems to be like miles apart from one another on a stretch of deserted beach. And he not only kills Ted Danson, but he forces Danson to watch what exactly is going to happen to him, because Danson's character has to experience the death of his lover, watching that on the monitor as like the tide comes in over and over again and washes over. And while he's watching that, Nielsen is kind of narrating it and saying, hey, like, you can't, get out of breath. You have to hold your breath. You have to, like, the water's going to be so cold going over you, and that's going to make it so much worse. There's absolutely, it's just so wonderful just how devilish and how ingenious and just cruel and vindictive that this death sequence is for the two lovers in this movie. It's what I love about it so much.
Oh, totally.
It's a really creative way to kill someone, every summer we go out to the beach and spend a week there. And so, I've seen the tide way far out and coming back in and all those sorts of things. And just that idea of being helplessly buried in the sand and this coming in and coming over you is so frightening as well. But it's very creative. And Tom Savini always talks about how George Romero would call him and say, hey, start thinking of ways to kill people. I know they didn't come up with this particular method, but man, it's just so great. It's so interesting and unique. And I haven't seen that done at anything else,
That's great. Hey guys, I gotta pee real quick. I'll be just a second.
I do too. Let's pause for 1 minute. Okay. I'm gonna keep it rolling, and let's have a pee break.
Hi, I'm Kelly. You'll find me heading up the social media while drinking a can of beer.
And I'm Jess. I'm the witchy spinster who can be found behind the scenes crafting.
And we are the Spinsters of Horror.
We have a monthly horror podcast called I Spit on Your Podcast,
which is semi-academic with a dash of feminism, and we aren't afraid to tackle tough subject matter or just have a little fun.
You can find us on our website at www.spinstersofhorror.com.
Follow us on Twitter at Horror Spinsters.
You can find the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, and more.
And remember, the future of fear is female.
Where were we?
We were just kind of like wrapping up the Tide one.
Okay. So, all right. I know what I wanted to mention. I love Savini's design of the waterlogged undead here.
Oh, it's great.
You would have mentioned the seaweed coming off of them, but just like how they were like fish belly white and wrinkled and just blown up from absorbing all the salt water. But you top that off also with like that waterlogged gurgly voice. And it goes from kind of kitschy to kind of terrifying in a heartbeat.
Just the design work in this movie in general, the makeup. I mean, it shows like how in tune with practical effects and makeup that Romero like was, right till the end, Romero, like he was a filmmaker that really loved, and you could tell he loved practical effects. Like when I think of practical effects in horror, I think of George Romero. I think of Brian Usna. I think of, Stuart Gordon, filmmakers like that was just kind of in love with giving fans practical effects that looked really great. And I think Creepshow is a great example of that.
Oh, absolutely true. And then you have that last, and again, look, we talked about these morality tales. The film ends with Leslie Nielsen's character getting the exact same death that he gave to his victims over or now. But it ends with, like Nielsen, like you said, talking shit, like screaming, I can hold my breath for a long time.
I can hold my breath for a long time.
It's just, it's so good. And I think it speaks to the casting of this movie. And I know that horror often works best when you have a bunch of unknowns, because you can really buy into the reality of the horror. But I think this movie is so wonderfully cast. There's no one that I would replace in this movie. All right. So in the interest of time, let's move on to my favorite short. And I think a lot of folks' favorite short, The Crate. This
seems to be like the sort of the crown jewel or the centerpiece, even though it's not the center story. It is it seems to be the one that was sort of the whole movie sort of leaning into a little bit.
I believe it's the longest of the short, and it's about 40 to 45 minutes long. So it's almost, you're coming up. You could easily have stretched this to a feature film, I think. If you wanted to, but it works perfect. It's like it's a leisurely pace to it overall, but it still works so well. And it centers around, I just mentioned the casting. Part of why I love this movie, I don't know if you make Creepshow as a movie in 2020, that Hal Holbrook and Fritz Weaver get these prominent roles. Because, you have these guys that are in their latter years, their 50s and 60s. I don't know if you're going to say, we're going to give these two older gentlemen a role that's going to really be the linchpin of this movie overall. I almost feel like you would get Tom Jane and Logan Marshall Green or a Patrick Wilson in their place, like if you were making this movie in 2020. And I don't think that works nearly as well, because Hal Holbrook is able to really transmit such a sad sack vibe that really makes this. It's what makes this work, because he becomes like such an opportunist. Like the moment he realizes I have an out, I can get rid of this bitch once and for all. He takes it, and you don't. Through the first 2/3 of the short, you don't see any chance in hell that someone who is like such a sad, beaten down, mousy little dude could ever be capable of something so conniving. And when I say get rid of this bitch, we could only be referring to Billy, played so wonderfully by Adrienne Barbeau.
Oh, Dexter, you are such a child. Now, you and Henry both, you're such children. But at least Henry has me to take care of him, don't you, dear?
Tabby, Richard, I'd like you to meet Dexter Stanley, my distinguished professor in the zoology department.
Pleasure to meet you, Professor Stanley.
Just Dex will do it.
Dex, thank you.
This is Henry and Wilma Northrop.
Oh, just call me Billy. Everyone does.
Billy?
You need someone to show you the ropes, hon. You just come see me. I know all the best stores.
Well, nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you.
So, you buying or renting?
Oh, actually, we're renting at the moment.
It's just as well. Buying real estate in a college town is a friggin' pain in the ass. You take my word for it.
Henry is in the English department, and Wilma...
Oh, I just take care of Henry. Believe me, he needs it. Did you ever meet a man who didn't? What's the matter with you two? You're not drinking?
Well, actually, we just got here.
Oh, well, we can take care of that. You just come on with me. Henry, you stay here till I get back.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Oh, honey, these people are dry. Now take care of them. They don't know what they're doing. So when Parker told me that I was out of line, I told him he ought to get laid. I mean, Parker, I said, if you just have your ashes hauled, you wouldn't have to spend all this time playing Emily Vanderbilt. Or Emily Van Buren. Or whoever that etiquette crotch is.
Excuse me. I don't know why they keep inviting her.
I think casting, if there's one short in this movie that just is a testament to the casting, it's this one. I mean, like you said, if they made it today, they would be cast with like, you know, younger, more popular actors. But I think that that's a testament to how films were made back in the day, where it was more about who would do the best job and not about popularity and anything. I mean, a couple of recent examples that really impressed me. I mean, Jamie Lee Curtis headlining Halloween 2018. You know, Lynn Shay becoming the focal point of the Insidious movies. The entire cast of VFW. Like, we get movies like that blow us away because you're like, wow, there's older actors given chances to shine because they're that good. You know,
well, even in outside the horror genre, you get a movie like Knives Out.
Yeah.
You know, where you've got Christopher Plummer and Jamie Lee Curtis and Don Johnson in these great roles that are, you know, central, and they carry the film. It's an ensemble piece,
and it's great because these films that we're talking about, they're kind of throwbacks to the era of Creepshow and films of the 70s and early 80s, because I mean they were very much open to casting whoever would be best. And I mean, dude, Adrienne Barbeau in this movie is so good. You hate her so much, and it's almost like you're seeing all these, like, not even just genre, but I mean, I'll speak just in a genre sense. All these horror icons in one movie. I mean, Hal Holbrook, you know, was just in The Fog with Adrienne Barbeau, who was married to John Carpenter, who would, you know, she had also
who would
done
go
Wes
on to
Craven
star in
movie.
Swamp Thing and
Dude, yeah, exactly. And it's just so cool to watch all these people tell these tales. As a horror fan. And I mean, even as a young kid, I was always a kid that would, you know, watch the end credits religiously and find out who did everything. So to see all these people that, like, you know, my grandma was very crucial into my upbringing as far as like being appreciation of film. All these actors like Hal Holbrook that my grandma would love too. Like, this was a movie that I could watch with my grandma and just be satisfied, even as like a bloodthirsty horror fan too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think Barbeau almost didn't take this role. Like, she was married to Carpenter at the time, like you said, Jerry, and you know, he was like, you got to take this role. And she read the script and she read the part, and she's like, she's such a fucking bitch. Like, I do not want to be associated with a character that's just so hateful and unlikable. And Carpenter was like, no, you'd be perfect for it. Now, they're no longer married, so I think that might maybe kind of like let you know where his mind was at that time. But as horrible as like Billy is as a person, I think the reason why, as an audience, you love to hate her so much is like the character of Billy doesn't give a flying fuck about what others are saying about her or what she says to other people. You know, she like flits around this faculty party, which is this really snooty white tie affair. And while one of the things I noticed on this watching, a lot of the other women that Billy interacts with, like, they are totally buttoned up. Like, there's one wife who she is wearing a skirt that goes down almost past her ankles, and her shirt is buttoned up, like the top button is not even undone. And you know that the school is out. It's the middle of summer. So, you know, it's going to be hot as balls no matter where they are. And she's in this like dour white and gray, almost like she's like an extra in The Witch. And so you have all these women dressed like that. And then there's Billy in this really like garish clothing, and like her cleavage is ready to spill out.
Perm.
She has the perm going on, and she's like, why don't you have a drink? Let's get you loaded up. And she's just like absolutely running the show. And meanwhile, people are whispering, like, why do they even bring this woman around any? Like, there's just an open disdain for Billy that goes on here. So I love her. Like, it's God. And again, she gets comeuppance for being so horrible. Yes, it's a little bit over the top. Getting eaten by a crate monster is probably not how most marriages should end. But it's just like, she's so wonderful in this role.
Oh, it's great. And really quickly, I forgot. I'm so disappointed in myself for getting to mention this during the Father's Day segment. Props to John Amplis for playing the father's reanimated corpse.
Yes.
John Amplis, I mean, he played fucking Martin, which is one of my favorite vampire movies of all time, you know? But yeah, I just wanted to quickly go back to that. But the crate, I mean, Barbeau is so good at being bad in this movie, which is funny because, I mean, like, you know, I think Stevie Wayne is one of the most genuine, nice characters in The Fog. I mean, if there's a character that anchors The Fog, it's that character. So it's fun to see her play something like that, and it's something like Creepshow where you kind of just want to throw it through a fucking window, you know?
Absolutely. So The Fog, very simply, is about a discovery that's made at a Ivy League college during the middle of the summer, where a crate is found from like about 60 years prior, and one of your characters of Dexter, a tenured professor who is single and definitely has an eye for the ladies. And by ladies, I mean very young undergrad students that he happens to be teaching, goes and opens this crate and very quickly gets one of the graduate assistants and the school custodian eaten by a hairy ape beast that was living inside of it in some really wonderful cartoony splatter effects that Savini just goes all out for here. What do we think of the design of this creature? Because it's kind of like, looks like kind of a very, you know what it looks like? It looks like the Abominable from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
No, totally. When I was a kid, for some weird reason, I have no idea why I connected the two, but for some weird reason when I was a kid, I always thought it was the same creature in the crate that was in Big Trouble in Little China at the end.
Okay.
You know, that popped up. Like, I always thought, like, it looked like Abominable. At the same time, it kind of had that kind of, like, otherworldly kind of, like, monster-ish quality to it.
Yeah, but that thing could fucking eat because it does not leave a single trace of two 200-pound men within, like, 20 minutes of, like, eating of one another. Like, that thing could go to goddamn town. And what's funny is you see the role reversal between Henry and Dexter here. And part of what I love is like Henry's fantasy world resolves around him like ridding himself of Billy once and for all. And so you see a quick segment of his imagination where he puts a bullet right through the middle of her skull, and then the faculty politely golf clapping him for doing it. But while Dexter is like as most of us would be, like kind of a mess when he sees this, Henry very quickly launches a plan to rid himself of Billy.
What are you doing, Henry? What are you doing? What I should have done a long time ago. Get in there, Wilma. Tell him to call you Billy, you bitch. Stop it! Stop it, Henry! I'll scream! Oh, scream all you want. I'll help you. Wake up! Wake up! Whatever you are, wake up! Wake up! Dinner time! Poison meat! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake!
Oh, that was great, Henry. That was just great. You think this is a Friday night fight? Huh? Is that what you think? You want to see some real content? Same old Henry, afraid of your own shadow. You know what, Henry? You're a regular barnyard exhibit. Sheep's eyes, chicken guts, piggy friends, and shit for brains. No good at departmental politics. No good at making money. No good at making an impression on anybody. And no good at all in bed. When was the last time you got it up, Henry? Huh? When was the last time you were a man in our bed? Now get out of my way, Henry, or I swear to God you'll be wearing your balls for earrings. And I swear to God, if you ever touch me...
Oh, just tell it to call you Billy.
Haven't we at some point like been in that same position, at certain points of our life?
Whew. I am pleading the fifth.
No, I don't mean like currently. I just mean like throughout life,
But, and eventually after Barbeau makes this wonderful speech that completely cuts the knees out from under Henry, this thing pops up out of nowhere and pulls her in. And Halbrook just delivers probably my favorite line in the whole movie that I just get in tears whenever I hear it, I just get in tears laughing. He's like, just tell it to call you Billy. Just
That's right.
So do we think I watching this movie now, I read a lot of queer subtext between the relationship of Henry and Dexter, and there's almost unrequited love that they kind of have, or at least that Henry has for Dexter overall.
There's something going on there. Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Whether it was intentional or not, I don't know. But I mean, that's definitely how I read it too.
Honestly, I think it's a great observation. It's not something that came to mind for me, but
Well, there's just something there in these longing looks that Holbrook gives, and when you find out later on, when he's scolded by Billy, and she asks, like, when's the last time you've been a man in bed? That you have and by all accounts, like, Henry's character is what you would look at outwardly as a success. He's a tenured professor at a prestigious college. He's accepted by his colleagues. I mean, he lives in this beautiful home. I mean, look at the library of that. I mean, number one, just to have a home where you have a library in your house, all right? So by all measures, he's what we would outwardly think of as a success. And yet he is anchored to this absolutely hateful woman who there's no love between them. And like she says, like, you're not even a man in our bedroom. He can't even.
Well, the only sense of not enjoyment, the only sense of like being content that we see of that character is when he's around Dexter.
Right.
When he's around Barbeau's character, it's just just being miserable, So I mean, I think it's pretty. I think it's there, and I'm curious. Like, I'll look into it. I'm curious if that was ever the intent. It's interesting.
So that's the way I read it, and maybe I'm reading too much into it. But I don't know. I thought there was a wonderful kind of love story waiting to blossom between Henry and Dexter. Even though Henry now basically has Dexter by the balls for the rest of their natural life at that point.
Yeah.
All right. We're coming up on our last full segment. They're creeping up on you, which I think probably has like the visual that most people, when they think of Creepshow, it's probably what they remember the most.
I know my son will.
Yeah, this one's incredibly difficult for me to watch. I can't. I hate bugs. Like I don't know if there's a PETA for bugs, but if there is, don't come at me. I'm just saying it. Like I'm not a fan. Cockroaches. Oh, they drive me nuts. This one just gets to me so much, and it gets under my skin. I also think it's really good, but it's the one that I revisit. I think the least.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, my son's reaction to this one was okay. We've watched several horror movies over the past year or so, and most of them don't really bother him. And we've watched several of the Nightmare movies. We've watched a lot of the Friday the 13th, all the Child's Play, all sorts of things. The one that he covered his face on and freaked out about was this segment of Creepshow. Was the first one that really got to him. So
yeah,
well, it's just,
I can't blame him. Yeah,
it's not just about a bug. It's about the idea of thousands of bugs coming at you. Like that's just terrifying to me, And it's it's about it's about this just really just racist piece of crap, old miserable man that's also terrified of cockroaches and bugs in general. So I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, there's nothing better than seeing like, a racist piece of shit, have to deal with just anything that they're miserable about,
right.
Like I get a big satisfaction watching this character go through this, but it's just the idea of the cockroaches and stuff. Just,
Right.
Yeah.
Matt Fowler of IGN, when I was doing my research for Creepshow and just reading up on the history of it, Matt Fowler had an article on IGN last year that really describes this segment perfectly. Like, what if Ebenezer Scrooge was not only a miser, but like super racist and deathly terrified of bugs?
Yeah.
And that really sums this up. And we talked a little bit earlier about how the ingenuity of filmmaking of Romero and the casting of the movie. And Jerry, you mentioned the love for practical effects overall. Part of what makes this segment work so well is that every bug on that screen is a real bug and not someone sitting behind a computer keyboard just designing an animation.
No, totally.
Yeah.
And I mean, this segment especially also highlights how far a lot of these people will go to give their viewers something. I mean, in your notes, and I was reading on this too, like the bugs put out like a really bad odor as well. So can you imagine being on that set with thousands of bugs?
Tens of thousands. Not just
it
thousands,
seems like Romero just like gets off on this stuff. I mean, poor Joe Pilato having to sit there with like real guts hanging out in Day of the Dead, smelling that stuff.
Yeah.
And
like
Romero in Just Desserts, when he describes the cockroaches, he not only talks about like cockroaches, he goes, well, a New York City cockroach.
Yeah.
So he had a very specific kind of cockroach in mind. And he was saying that like in order to purchase them for film, he was saying they would typically cost about 50 cents a bug at that point. And I forget, I guess he had a bug guy, but they didn't, because they ended up not paying anywhere near that. But it would have been basically about $100,000 worth of bugs overall if they went with that original plan. And the crew did talk about how when cockroaches are frightened, like one of their defense mechanisms is they emit this kind of odor. And you might not notice that on one bug or maybe even 100 bugs, but when you have tens of thousands of bugs, how just the terrible odor that would be there. And the crew discuss how to this day they can still like very vividly recall the exact stink that these bugs were emitting on set. And they would talk about because you had to corral them, how they would, because you have an open set, you would have Vaseline layered all over the top of the open set so the bugs couldn't escape. And
you're screwing me up right now.
At the end of shooting, all of the bugs had to be euthanized as well.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, so very sad. But yeah, it's about a E.G. Marshall plays Upton Pratt. And again, like this is like the 1% of the 1%, and he's a mean, old, racist fucking bastard that very clearly is based on Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire and germaphobe, who, by the way, like researching this really fun fact I did not know about Howard Hughes, like 2 decades after his death, his estate had a psychological autopsy done on him, which I had never heard of that type of thing before. And it consisted of forensic psychologists combing through Hughes's old court dispositions, letters Hughes wrote to his mother, newspaper reports, phone records, transcriptions of calls Hughes would make to his private pilots. Hughes was famous for being a terrible germaphobe. He would like wear like Kleenex
boxes
on his feet. He would like burn clothes if someone sneezed in the same room as him. And he ended up being like, it went so far that he ended up not even, he had to take care of himself, and he was really grotesque towards the end here. So Upton Pratt clearly based on a not well Howard Hughes.
Yeah, and the racist elements of the character, just he's so just nonchalant about being a piece of shit in this movie, and it's like I think that goes maybe to like how great of a performance it is. because like it feels like effortless, you know, like it's not overly dramatic. It's very cold and like calculative. It's weird. It's odd.
And again, it's having that old school. You have E.G. Marshall, who his career dated back really to the early days of television, back in the early to mid 50s, when you would first start getting mass production of TVs and seeing them in every living room. So you have a career that dates all the way back to that and would carry on to like a really diverse career where he was jury number 4 in 12 Angry Men. He plays the president in Superman 2, you know, all the way up through like National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, where he's he's the asshole father-in-law.
That's right.
Who like just like emasculates Chevy Chase in every single Clark Swald at every turn here. As much as we remember the Roaches, what really disturbs me watching this short again is like the disembodied voices on the telephone. The disembodied voices of Mr. White, like when Mr. White's face is pressed up against that small, you know, round glass cutout in the door, and you see this giant kind of Cheshire cat smile, and the way his voice is so disembodied, as well as the phone call between Pratt and his rival's wife, the business rival who committed suicide, and she's basically cursing him over the phone. It's so terrifying. Like it gives us a surreal feel to the short overall that exists outside of just the fact that you have tens of thousands of bugs in here.
I think that it speaks on how great this anthology is, because you have these stories that are very different from each other, but they still feel like they're in the same movie. And I think that's where a lot of anthologies get it wrong. They either try so hard to be basically the same exact short each time, or they're so different and they don't feel thematically close or anything close to the previous one, to where it feels kind of disjointed. Creepshow, every segment is very different, but it still feels like Creepshow, and I think that it's such a good example of a very solid anthology.
And the blinding whiteness too. Like one of the things that gets me in this movie is there's almost no furniture in this penthouse apartment, and everything is blindingly white in this movie, and it creates this like really harsh, grating look to it overall. 'Cause it's not the soft white that kind of puts you at ease, but really it's just in your face and just it adds
that
level
also
of
speaks
discomfort.
on totally, and that also speaks on the racism of the character. You know, it's not just white, it's white. You know what I mean? Like his character is so just like ugh.
Yeah,
I hate that character, but I mean that means that.
And you're meant to. You know, and you're
totally.
absolutely
You
meant to,
definitely
where you kind of like, you love to hate Billy so much that you kind of, at the end, love her. Like, and look, some of us would pay good money to get emasculated by a character like Billy on a weekly basis, okay? You know, I'm just saying, no kink shaming here. Like, Billy would absolutely, if Billy were to survive in that crate with the creature, which if anybody could, it would be Billy. I could easily see a sequel with Billy leading that thing around on a leash while she's wearing, you know, thigh-high boots.
I think you're revealing a lot in this episode, Mike.
You know, you guys need to excuse me for a few minutes. I'll be right back. But yeah, so I can see that where you don't love Upton Pratt in any way, shape, or form. You really, really loathe that character. From start to finish. So the only thing left to talk about with Creepshow now is really the kind of wraparound segment with a mustacheless Tom Atkins.
You know, I love Tom Atkins so much, and I revisited one of my favorite movies of all time, The Ninth Configuration, recently, and Tom Atkins is that too, minus the mustache. You know, Tom Atkins is somebody that needs a mustache. Very few men need a mustache, but Tom Atkins does. You know,
mustaches need Tom Atkins.
Right, yeah. When we talk about Creepshow, I think the wraparound isn't mentioned as much, but there's a lot going on there. You know, I recently interviewed Joe Hill for Dread Central a few months back for his comic book line, and we kind of talked about Creepshow a little bit, because Joe Hill later on, one of his short stories was adapted by Tom Savini for the Creepshow TV show.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like Joe Hill's return to Creepshow. But he was saying that, he was 8 years old when he played Billy in Creepshow. Billy was an abused kid. In Joe's words, I played Billy, who was an abused kid who used a voodoo doll to get even with his dad. And he said, if you think about it, that was a character who was defending his love of having horror comics in his life, which says a lot. And the character of Billy in the wraparound was us. It's all of us. Yeah. The churches that told us that we shouldn't listen to Slayer, the parents that said you shouldn't watch Halloween or Zombie, the schools that suspended me for bringing a backpack full of Stephen King novels to distribute in 4th grade. Joe Hill's character is very much us, horror fans that had to fight tooth and nail just to be able to enjoy what we liked. And I love the wraparound almost as much as the actual segments in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, it's a wonderful, and I think a good anthology, like it really completes an anthology. And honestly, what's missing from Creepshow, the television show, is kind of like these little wraparound moments overall to it. And what I love about Atkins' character is just how self-righteous that he is in this movie. And he has that classic line that is so good. I'm just going to hold for 1 second. There's a little bit of motion back there, so I'm going to hold off for 1 sec. What I love about what's going on with his character is he has this really great line where he's like, that's why God created fathers, babe. That's why God created father. It's like, and he's so smug, and you could tell that he really put a lot of thought into that line overall, like the dad delivering it. But also, like, how creepy is Joe Hill? His face in this movie, like, he's the spitting image of his dad, but he just has this, like, when he grins in this movie, he's so fucking creepy.
Well, you could tell, like, he looks like Stephen King, especially now, with the beard. Like, it's kind of weird.
He does.
But, like, even as a kid, you can tell that he was brought up on a love and affinity for horror and just like stuff like this, because he is having so much fun playing that role. That smile sums up every kid getting to play their favorite games.
And apparently Atkins really slapped the shit out of him. And he went to Stephen King and he was like, I gotta hit the kid here. And King was like, fucking go for it, man. Beat him like he's a redheaded stepchild. So,
well, there's in the In Search of Darkness documentary that I recently saw, Atkins talks about that a little bit. That scene. Apparently, King was on set when he did the slap. And so.
And was King like, let me show you how I hit him?
Actually, the story's a little different according to Atkins. It was more like King was like, this is my son. You're not like really going to hit him, are you?
Oh, I thought it was the opposite. I must have done it wrong. Okay.
So, but stories change over time. I mean, that's the funny thing. I'm sure there's probably another interview with Atkins saying exactly what you just said.
I will never trust a man who in every interview about Halloween 3 says Micah Myers.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I'm just kidding. I love Tom Atkins, but
if Tom Atkins says it's Micah Myers, then it's Micah Myers,
right?
Okay? It's John Carpenter who's wrong, not. So, and I guess to this day, like Hill and Atkins remain very friendly, and they routinely write and email one another, and I guess there was a genuine warmth between them on the set, so that's kind of like really.
Well, Atkins is such a warm person in general. Yeah. Like, it's funny that we're doing Creepshow because, like, recently, like I said, I interviewed Joe Hill, and a month or two before that, I talked to Tom Atkins for something, and he. In the middle of the interview, Tom Atkins started just talking about like all these different people he's worked with and what they're up to in their life. Like, this person's in Philadelphia. This person lives in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. Like he's such a jovial, friendly guy in real life that it's funny to see him play this like really abusive dad in this movie.
Right. And I think part of that comes from just being a guy like born and raised in Pittsburgh and getting into acting, like almost falling into acting later in life, as opposed to it being like a Hollywood type of guy.
And very self-deprecating.
Right.
When I talked to him, I told him that, in my opinion, he's a legend, and he was just like, well, I've never just been cast. I've had to audition. I've never been a leading man. And I'm like, dude, you're Tom Atkins. Fuck Chuck Norris. Yeah. Tom Atkins.
So we have a few. That wraps up our discussion of Creepshow. We asked for some questions and commentary from our listeners over on Twitter @Pod and Pendulum. Are we ready to tackle these?
Let's do it.
All right. Up first, we have from Dalton Turner, who is @DartJagar _ asking, which anthology from the 2000s plus do you guys think comes closest to the mantle of Creepshow? And I think this is a relatively easy one. You know what? I'm gonna throw a curveball. I'll let you guys answer first.
For me, I'm such a sucker for a good anthology. There have been really good ones, and there have been quite a few bad ones. One that I really enjoyed so much, actually two, Tales from Halloween, but one that I really enjoyed was VHS 2. Because that one, you get everything from a GoPro zombie movie to a rambunctious kids sleepover alien invasion. You get a robotic eye. You get so many different things in a cult movie. All this in one movie that these shorts shouldn't feel like they work together, but they do. So I think VHS 2 is one for me.
Yeah. For me, I'm probably going to go with the obvious answer here and say Trick or Treat.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just so good. And that sort of stands out as and I love both the ones that you mentioned, Jerry. Are fantastic. I really like both of those. But Trick or Treat is just sort of it has sort of a classic quality to it.
There's an anthology from a few years ago called Southbound.
Oh, yes.
That I think Tread Central put it out.
I think
either them or Bloody Disgusting. It might have been under the Bloody Disgusting Presents line. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, I think it was Bloody.
But Southbound, it has a wraparound that circles back into it and on itself. And the way that each segment basically takes the baton from the one before it is done in a really clever and ingenious way. Each of the stories are really creepy. They all tackle a different segment of horror, but they do create this one really cohesive work of art. So I would say for me, Southbound is one of the better, really clever, ingenious work of anthology horror. Although I think all three choices from VHS 2, which is such an upgrade over the first VHS, and Trick or Treat, you really can't go wrong with any of those.
No, totally.
All right. Comment here from Jeremy Walkenfuss, that's J. Walkenfuss, says Ed Harris commits some of the finest dance moves of all time in Creepshow. Absolutely agree, as we discussed. Yep, yes. Absolutely. Mikey Alexander with a comment. That's Mikey Hates It at Twitter. Fluffy messed me up for a while, even though he's third after American Werewolf and The Thing. Those movies made me have to leave the theater and made going into basements difficult for quite a long time. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that Tom Savini is known for great, gore effects and kill effects. So to see him do a creature like that was really cool. I mean, it was sort of like, sort of the kinds of thing we associate more with Rick Baker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's so good. He was just so much talent. That could go in. He could do anything.
Absolutely. Question from Steven Podcaster, who is Stay Bob, STE Bob 1984 over on Twitter. Do you think this is the greatest horror anthology of all time? If not, what do you think is? I say for me it is. I think that this is as great as, like, say, a Black Sunday is, and Tales from the Dark Side and Trick or Treat. To me, really, Creepshow is the pinnacle of what you can do as an anthology movie?
Personally, I think Creepshow 3 is better. No, I'm just kidding. No, Creepshow is definitely, I think, hands down the best.
Mm-hmm.
But Creepshow 2 is very close behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Brett Gallman, our friend Brett, this is more about Creepshow 2, but would Sam Whitemoon's hair have gotten him paid and laid if he did make it to Hollywood?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I'd like to think that's the same character in Mindhunter.
Yeah, absolutely. He would be knuckle deep in vagina. Absolutely.
Knuckle deep. Oh my god.
Just absolutely would be getting paid and laid
knuckle deep
all over the place.
I'm gonna use that.
What about you? Anytime you want. Hey, if you want to hop off and say like, babe, let's go get knuckle deep right now.
I think I'm going to and see how it fares.
See how it please. Can you report back how that goes?
I will.
How about you, Brian? Not are you going knuckle deep, but you think Sam Whiteman's hair.
Do you think he's going to get paid and laid? Well, of course he is.
That hair, man. That hair.
It's amazing. I mean, now it's on Chief Woodenhead's hand, but
Yeah.
So Nat Bremar, our good friend Nat, who, by the way, folks, once I edit this fucking beast of a reading we did, now I want to say poor Nat, but he chose the script and he was our stage director. He basically read for 2 straight hours as giving script direction. For our
I will say during that script reading, I was probably one of the only person or two that wasn't somehow intoxicated.
Yeah.
I wasn't either, but
okay. That script reading was so much fun to like sit back and listen to when I wasn't doing my lines.
So I was not drunk. That's what scares me. I had 1 drink. I had a very healthy dollop of gin with some lime and some seltzer. But I was far from drunk, and I kind of felt like at one point that was turning it into an intervention for me.
What's funny is a lot of the people that were saying that were obviously
smashed.
intoxicated.
They were so smashed.
One of my favorite things was by the end of it, like I think Izzy just stopped giving a shit and just was like partying. It was so much fun. I loved it.
Well, Izzy had said when we started to do this, she's like, by the way, no one ever makes it to the end of these scripts. And we are 2 for 2 right now. So we'll have later this week. But Nat's question, getting back at Nat Bremar, what is the best segment and why is it the crate? It's fucking Billy, dude. Actually, it's Hal fucking Holbrook, for one, and Adrienne Barbeau is Billy. I mean, they are the power couple in horror movies of 1980.
When people talk about John Carpenter, and I get so much shit for this a lot, and I kind of have fun with it. They mention John Carpenter's best films, and usually The Thing is first or second. And I get a lot of shit for saying, I love The Thing, but it's probably my number 7, because I mean, The Fog is my number 3, and I think The Fog is like one of the best movies of all time. And to see Hal Holbrook and Adrienne Barbeau together again in Creepshow, like, I love it. I love it so much.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, when a couple people responded to Nat's question, Necromomicon, which, oh my God, what a lovely name. Jess, she's Armenian as well. She's part of my tribe. Jess Karakakashan. I'm totally mispronouncing that. I cannot speak. But Necromomicon, The Reckoning, says truth, and the segment has the best score. Don't at her over that. To which the Gill Monster responded, fair, but just so you know, I've got a plotting Camptown racist urge from something to tide you over in my head every hour of every day. Which, that's what I wanted to mention. What kind of screws up something to tide you over is at the very end of that segment, the music takes a comical little coda to it, which I think ruins I didn't like that bit. I think the music gets a little too comical for the end of that really fucked up short.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's the crate. But that's my answer. Gentlemen, defend Jordy Verrill.
I think we did in detail on this episode. I think Jordy Verrill, that episode, it's heartfelt, it's sad, it's depressing as hell, and it's very relatable. You know, I've never found a monster in a crate, but I've been heavily into debt and feeling like it's crippling me. So that segment's mine.
Mm-hmm. You know, and as much as I love Jordy Verrill, I'm going to defend not E.G. Marshall's character, but the segment of their creeping up on you, just because it is the one that I will forever remember as the one that finally freaked out my kid.
There you go.
Right.
I mean, he's just been like everything. I mean, Tina's death, you know, all these things that we've seen, and he's like, yeah, that was pretty cool. And now he's like, yeah, you know, to actually see him grossed out was pretty awesome.
That's lovely. All right, our last question from our friend Jacob Davidson, writer over at iHorror and the Paracast podcast network. Jacob Davidson asks, which character had the best comeuppance? Personally, I think it was Upton Pratt. All right, so gentlemen, which character do you think gets the best comeuppance overall?
I'd have to go with Leslie Nielsen's character.
Yeah.
You know, he dies talking shit, but it's so much fun to know that like he's scared as hell, and he's talking a lot of smack at the end, but you know he's worried.
Yeah.
So that's mine.
Brian.
I'm gonna go with Upton Pratt. I'm gonna go with Upton Pratt. That it's, you know, you want to see him get it. You really, really do. So
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, my friend. You finish off.
Oh, no, I'm done. Go ahead.
I agree with Jerry. I think Leslie Nielsen's character of Richard gets the best comeuppance overall, basically because his own weapons have been turned against him at that point. So the irony there is just too delicious to not appreciate overall. Totally. And even though he's kind of like a stubborn bastard to the very end, it's really beautiful. Yeah, so I got to go with Leslie Nielsen's character there. All right, we did about 2 hours on Creepshow.
Yeah,
which means we really have 4 to dedicate to Creepshow 3.
Yes. I'm gonna try to talk AJ Bowen into coming on for Creepshow 3, because even though he was into it, like in the movie, like I know that he has nothing really super great to say about that one. So
yeah, one of our listeners asked if we're going to talk about Creepshow the television series, and I think that when we do Creepshow 3. That we were going to probably, I think, divide that up a little bit between Creepshow 3 and the Shudder Creepshow series, if you guys are okay with that. Simply because, like, I don't, you know, I want to have some positive things. Right now, the world doesn't need a lot of negativity, so I think we can get Creepshow 3 out of the way and talk about some of the highlights. You know, we won't cover the whole series in tremendous depth, but I think we might talk about 1 or 2 of our favorite segments each. And even though at times that show doesn't really feel like Creepshow, it's still there. It has some really fun segments to it. Overall, that I really appreciate.
Totally.
Yeah.
So, listeners, thank you so much for bearing with us. We potentially have a lot of material that we're going to be kind of dropping over the next few weeks here, as we're all kind of sheltered in place and we don't have a lot to do. So along with our 3 episodes on Creepshow, later this week we will be releasing our table reading of an earlier draft of A Nightmare on Elm Street 5. And it seems like people really enjoyed our Maximum King reading. I think we're kind of honing in on the next script we're going to do after that. I'm kind of leaning towards Wes Craven's Elm Street 3 script. And I think when we mentioned that, a lot of people got pretty excited. My daughter wants to record another commentary, so we're looking at her and I doing pieces together. And I think completely appropriate movie for a 9-year-old. But we're trying to stay sane right now. I think a lot of people are, there's economic anxiety, there's health anxiety, there's when is this going to end anxiety right now. And our listeners and our friends that we've made through the horror community have really kept me sane through this.
No, totally. It's been a really good distraction, and I know I definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, me too.
So we will keep bringing you guys stuff as long as you guys want us to. So follow us over at the Pod and Pendulum. On Twitter, Pod and Pendulum. We have a Facebook page, which I think could stand to be a little bit more active on my end. But if you go to Facebook and look at Pod and Pendulum, we have a page over there. We would love to interact with all of our listeners. So send suggestions if there's anything you want to see us do. By all means, and fire over over on Twitter your PlayStation 4 handle, and let's get some Friday the 13th going some nights here, or some watch-alongs or whatnot. So, all right, gentlemen, any final words before we go?
No, this is fun. Can't wait for Creepshow 2.
Yeah, Creepshow 2 is a blast. I love that one too.
Yeah. All right, so we'll be back next week with Creepshow 2. Until then, everyone wash your hands and stay home.